the heroic acts of the St. Mary freedom fighter and rebel leader Tacky, otherwise referred to as the Generalissimo in the woods. On Easter Monday, April 7, 1760, under the leadership of this freedom fighter, with other enslaved, valiantly challenged, though beaten successfully, their enslavement and indeed the system of slavery. Their action inspired revolts throughout the island, engulfing Jamaica in tumult, lasting well over 18 months, forcing the government to impose martial law for the greater part of that period. The story of Tacky has been recounted several times, but I would like to recall it again in an effort to identify characteristics of this valiant and heroic enslaved African who daringly challenged the institution of slavery, and indeed all forms of social and economic oppression and repression and injustice, and came to influence the future of the system. Before discussing Tacky and his heroic revolt, it might be important to recall exactly the nature and character of enslavement in Jamaica and the Caribbean, and the necessity for rebellion. Slavery, my friends, was a most dehumanizing institution. Kings, queens, priests, priestesses, and commoners, all were forcibly uprooted from Africa and transported as cargo across the Atlantic to Jamaica and other parts of the America, in tightly packed ships to be enslaved. They lost their status, their human and civil rights, their traditional ways of governance, societal ties, and kinship. They were no longer regarded as human beings, but rather as multi-purpose tools or machines to be exploited. In law, they were categorized as chattels, properties owned by others who had full and total control over their lives. An enslaved person in Jamaica could be sold, mortgaged, killed, maimed, or anything the owner wished to do to his property. White racism and color prejudice came to characterize the society. This was a natural development of the system of black enslavement. Ironically, although the enslaved was seen in law as property, owners recognized their capacity to rebel. Hence, they came to classify the enslaved as peculiar species of property. It has been estimated that Jamaica demanded 7,000 to 10,000 enslaved labor per annum to satisfy plantation and other labor demands. However, under the prevailing regime, the enslaved population could not reproduce itself to any great degree to satisfy this demand. Natural increase among the enslaved was almost non-existent. Hence, there was a great reliance on the trade in enslaved people. It has been estimated that over 1 million Africans were imported into Jamaica to be enslaved during the period of the slave trade. It is true that a small portion was re-exported, but the vast majority were retained in the island. Despite this large number imported, at emancipation there were just over 300,000 enslaved persons, representing nearly 84% of the entire population, a large portion of which were African-born. Even when we factor in those who were freed or manumitted over time, the number of blacks in the island at freedom in 1838 was well below 350,000. This indicates clearly the harshness and rigors of the system and the toll it took on human lives, especially that of the enslaved blacks. The horrors of enslavement, its exploitative and dehumanizing character, and all its atrocities cannot be overemphasized. The enslaved population provided the primary labor force. It was on their backs that wealth were created, making Jamaica the richest colony in the British Empire by the mid-18th century. The greater proportion of this profit and wealth, however, was not plowed back into the local economy to foster long-term economic development, but was rather expropriated and repatriated to Britain. It has been estimated by Richard Sheridan that the value of Jamaica in 1775 was £18 million, and the annual returns to Britain from the island stood at £1.5 million. This figure has been revised upwards to £25 million and £1.8 million respectively. Eric Williams quite strongly argues that the profits from Caribbean slavery and British slave trade financed the British Industrial Revolution. It was from the gross exploitation of enslaved blacks that this wealth was created. Their reward for hard work was even harder work and more dehumanizing experiences. There was indeed a close correlation between the wealth of the island and the treatment of the enslaved. The more prosperous the colony and the unit of economy, whether plantations or subaltern economic activities, the more repressive and rigorous the regime, the harsher the treatment of the enslaved. Slave conditions became more and more degrading. The enslaved came to the island with no physical baggage. However, they came with their cultural baggage. And some of these African cultures survived the Middle Passage. African religious practices and beliefs, labeled Obia, the name that Europeans gave to all aspects of African Caribbean popular belief that they found alien and threatening, and Mayalism. These were among the foremost to be preserved. And it was of these religious practices, especially Obia, that the enslaved in their oppressed, dehumanized state resorted for solace and as means of pursuing conflict and responding to harm and wrongdoing being meted out to them primarily by the whites. In other words, in bondage, they reverted to spiritual aggression against the system of enslavement. Obia held out the possibility of gaining redress even in conflicts with people of superior status, including planters. Since recently, it was a highly accepted view that the term Obia originated from Obayafi, an Asante Tweet term for evil, witches, and sorcery. Hence, the negative connotations ascribed to Obia. Recent research, however, revealed that the word Obia is not derived from a word denoting harmful power or sorcery, but rather from another African term with entirely positive or at least neutral meaning. They postulate that the term probably derived from Igbo or related language in the Niger Delta, such as Ifik or Ibibia, where the term Ibia refers to doctor or healer, and one who enjoys a very positive role in the communities he serves or she serves. And where a related term Abia denotes various kinds of esoteric knowledge, including knowledge of herbal healing. In Africa, this religious practice and its practitioner, priest or priestesses, the one who had special knowledge of how to mobilize supernatural power for concrete needs, attended to the physical and spiritual health of the local communities. In Jamaica, Obia did all this and more. It served to console the enslaved in their repressed, dehumanized condition. These religious practitioners, the Obia man or Obia woman, were often solicited to wage spiritual warfare against white oppressors. Consequently, they came to be seen as a very scary and powerful warrior with supernatural powers, and so were not to be provoked. Thus to the whites, Obia had negative connotations. To them it was powerful sorcery. For the enslaved, Obia played very positive roles in their lives, especially in their attacks on the system. Obia came to play a leading role in Tacky's revolt, as I will discuss below. From what I've just stated, it is clear that the enslaved did not accept their natural position of enslavement. Indeed, from the very earliest stages of their enslavement, beginning from their capture in Africa, they resisted. The African people who were brought to Jamaica in chains were physically enslaved, but their minds and spirits were never totally captured. Their religious beliefs and practices, as I have just alluded to, as well as open revolt and non-violent resistance, characterized the enslaved's desire and aspirations for freedom. Open rebellions and other forms of resistance were replete in the Jamaican society during the period of enslavement. The enslaved were bent on taking their freedom by force. And one of the most violent and protracted rebellions of the enslaved population in the island is that to which I would like now to focus our attention, the Tacky Revolt in St. Mary in 1760. During the wee hours of Easter night, April 7, 1760, unknown to their masters, a band of about 50 to 100 enslaved, mostly from the Ballard's Valley estate belonging to Ballard Bedford, others from Esher, Frontier, Haywoodall, and the Trinity estates, gathered at Trinity to launch an attack on their enslavement through open revolt under the leadership of Tacky. They marched to Fort Haldane in Port Maria, where ammunition for the protection of the town was kept. After storming the fort, killing the storekeeper, and seizing about 4 barrels of gunpowder, a few musket balls, and 40 firearms, They marched to the nearby beach, where they cut off the lead weights of a number of fishing nets and fashioned them into bullets. They then went back to Trinity, well armed and ready for battle. But this time, however, an informant, an enslaved domestic from Trinity, rushed off to Ballard's Valley, 3 miles away, to inform his owner, Zachary Bailey, who was visiting with friends, of the actions of the insurgents at Port Maria. Bailey hurriedly rode in search of the insurgents in an effort to mollify them. And getting in sight of them, he saw the rebels defiantly advancing towards the house of the Ballard's Valley overseer, echoing what has been described as the Coromantine yell of war. Bailey moved close to the rebels, but he was greeted with shots which narrowly missed him, but killed the horse of his servant. Meanwhile, the insurgents pushed on with their intended purpose. Bailey then turned around and rode off to alert his fellow planters and to organize the local militia. In the meantime, from estate to estate, the freedom fighters wreaked death and destruction in their path. From Ballard's Valley to Esher through to Haywood Hall, they went destroying life and property. Works yard or factory buildings, houses, cane fields, all were set ablaze. At Esher, they stormed the great house, killing the overseer, a surveyor, a young boy, and 2 others. But here, they again encountered another act of treachery from a member of their own enslaved population. Yankee, a trusted slave, after helping with the futile defense of the house, fled to spread the news of the revolt. Continuing undaunted in their march for freedom, the freedom fighters killed a white man on foot. At this point, 14 other enslaved joined the revolt. The insurgents marched to Haywood Hall, where they set fire to the great house and factory works. They moved on to Ballard's Valley. Here, Tacky and his warriors killed the overseer and 3 others. By now, the ranks of the insurgents had swollen to over 400, including women. It has been estimated that the revolt eventually attracted over 30,000 enslaved persons. Now, delighted by their initial success, the insurgents prematurely retreated to a secluded glade just off the highway to refresh themselves. According to Edward Long, historian, the fatigue of the opening of their campaign had so exhausted their spirits by this time that they thought proper to refresh themselves a little before they renewed their hostilities. Having therefore a good magazine of hogs, poultry, rum, and other plunder of the like, they chose out a convenient spot surrounding the trees and a little retired from the road, where they spread their provisions and began to carouse. By later that evening, Bailey had managed to muster around 70 to 80 mounted militiamen to go in pursuit of the rebels. The troops were attracted to the location where the insurgents had stopped for rest and refreshment by the sound of their revelry. The troops made a surprise attack, forcing the fighters to retreat to the woods, but not before successfully holding off the troops with volleys of muskets. The troops eventually engaged rebels in a skirmish, killing about 8 of the insurgents. But even up to this point, the planters neither understood nor appreciated the planning and the extent of the rebellion. In fact, it was left to 2 enslaved from Beckford's estate to journey to Spanish Town to alert the Lieutenant Governor Sir Henry Moore of the situation. For to the local planters, this was just another revolt, which, like all others before, would be swiftly and speedily suppressed. They were to be sadly mistaken, as we'll see. The Lieutenant Governor, in his dispatch to the Colonial Office in Britain on the 8th of April 1760, reported that the insurgents had killed 16 white persons and great ravages done to plantations in the area. Immediately on hearing the news, shortly after noon on Tuesday, April 8th, Lieutenant Governor Moore declared martial law. Being a local plant himself, and having good knowledge of the terrain of the island, he dispatched the regular 74th and 49th regiments, who forced marches into St. Mary by way of Archer's Ridge, that is Troja, and the new road over Stony Hill and the Wagwater Valley, that's the Junction Road. He further sent urgent messages to mobilize the Leeward and the Windward Maroons to suppress the revolt. The whole operation was intended to encircle insurgents in a pincer-like maneuver. But the militia was sluggish and it has been reported that their performance was very disgraceful. And the regular troops proved no better. And worse yet, the cooperation from the Maroons proved difficult. For example, the Scotsall Maroons, on arrival in the Nutter Bay, refused to fight until they received arrears of bounty money for the return of runaways. Indeed, the Maroons showed a definite unwillingness to fight. Their hesitancy allowed the rebels to become more and more successful in their feat in the first few days of the revolt, due primarily to a lack of opposition and the swelling of their ranks. By Thursday, April 10th, many of the Maroons were forced to retreat. Later that night, a detachment of the 74th Regiment with Maroons at Davis Cove were attacked by rebels. The sentinels were shot, and the hut in which the soldiers were sleeping were set on fire. Many soldiers were killed. The only real success of the colonial officers during the first phase of their armed engagement with Tacky and his warriors was the capture and execution of one of the rebels' chief Obeahman, an old Coromantee. Edward Long gives a graphic description of his capture and the subsequent death of this Obeahman. He, with others of his profession, writes Edward Long, had been chief in counseling and instigating the credulous herd to whom these priests administer powder, which being rubbed on their bodies was to make them invulnerable. They persuaded them into a belief that Tacky, their generalissimo in the woods, could not possibly be hurt by the white man, for that he caught all the bullets fired at him in his hand and hurled them back with destruction to his foes. This old impostor was caught whilst he was tricked up with all his feathers, teeth, and other implements of his magic, and his attire, he suffered military execution by hanging. Many of his disciples, when they found that he was easily put to death, notwithstanding all the boasted feats of his power and incantations, soon altered their opinion of him and determined not to join their countrymen.
The informative information presented in this video is motivational and is positively aimed at inspiring, educating and entertaining the viewers with the cutting edge of critical reasoning. If you enjoy the contents on the Black Radar YouTube channel, please consider subscribing to show your support.